Somewhere in Kuwait, there is an address that a taxi driver will not take you to after midnight. Not because of crime, not because of the neighborhood's reputation, because of a wedding that supposedly happened there over 30 years ago. A wedding that, by daylight, no one can prove ever took place at all. This is the story of Noura Al-Taqaqa. Depending on who's telling it and where you first heard it, you might know her as Noura or Noura Al-Taqaqa. The spelling changes, the core of the story never does. She was a wedding singer, a good one, and one night she took a booking that she should have turned down and found herself performing for an audience that was not entirely human. I want to be upfront with you before we start. This story has circulated through the Gulf for more than 30 years and nobody has ever been able to fully confirm it. There's no surviving photograph of Noura that anyone has verified, no newspaper clipping, no official record of what happened to her afterward. What there is, instead, is a story that has been told and retold so many times in so many households that it's become something close to regional legend. Whether it happened exactly this way is something I can't tell you for certain. What I can tell you is that this is the most complete version of it, the version most people agree on when they tell it. Get comfortable. This one takes its time. Noura Al-Taqaqa built her career the quiet way, not through television, not through recorded albums, but through word of mouth, one wedding at a time, through the 1980s and into the 1990s. In Kuwait and across much of the Gulf, weddings were often segregated by gender, with private, women-only sections where female performers were specifically hired to sing and drum for the bride's side of the family. Noura became one of the most requested names on that private circuit. Families who hired her once tended to hire her again and pass her name along to relatives planning their own celebrations. She wasn't a celebrity outside that world. Most people beyond her immediate circuit had never heard of her. But within it, she was trusted, respected, and steadily booked, which is exactly the kind of reputation that makes a certain kind of phone call seem completely unremarkable when it finally comes. Because bookings on that circuit moved entirely through word of mouth and personal calls, there was never a paper trail behind any of it. No contracts, no public records. Which is part of why, decades later, almost nothing about that final night can be independently confirmed, including some versions of the story insist whether the man who called her that day was ever actually connected to any family at all. The night it happened began the way an ordinary work night begins for anyone in a booking-based trade, with a phone ringing and a stranger's voice on the other end. A man asked whether Noura and her band were free to perform that same evening. He didn't haggle over her fee, he didn't ask to hear a sample of her repertoire the way most families did before committing to a performer for their daughter's wedding. He simply gave her an address, told her what time to arrive, and offered a fee that was, by most accounts, unusually generous for a same-day booking. In hindsight, that generosity should have been the first warning sign. At the time, it read as good fortune, the kind of easy, well-paid gig every working musician hopes for. Noura and her band didn't spend long debating it. They agreed, and they began preparing to leave. The address put them in an upscale residential neighborhood. That detail matters because in 1990s Kuwait, weddings, even lavish ones, were still commonly hosted inside private family homes and compounds, not hotels or rented event halls the way they often are today. A wedding at a large private mansion wasn't unusual at all. It was exactly the kind of booking Noura had played dozens of times before. What was unusual, though none of them quite registered it until they were already parking outside, was that not one member of the band recognized the street. None of them had ever played an event in that particular part of the neighborhood before, despite years of working weddings across the city. The house lived up to the promise on the phone. It was opulent, decorated for a wedding from the outside, lit up, clearly the site of a major celebration. A woman greeted them at the door and welcomed them inside, exactly the way any host would on the biggest night of a family's year. Inside, the layout matched the traditional style Noura had performed in countless times before. Guests seated on long, cushioned mats along the floor. Food beginning to arrive in staged courses. a designated space set aside for the musicians to set up their instruments. Noura's band began unpacking their equipment. The female guests started arriving in greater numbers, filling the room with the particular noise and warmth of a wedding well underway. Nothing on the surface looked wrong yet. That changed within minutes. It is customary at Gulf weddings for guests to greet a well-known performer personally. A kiss on each cheek, sometimes 3, a few warm words of appreciation before the music even starts. Noura had received this exact greeting hundreds of times over her career. It was second nature to her. One by one, the women approached her and her bandmates to offer that same greeting. And one by one, something felt off. One of Noura's bandmates leaned close to her during a pause between greetings and whispered that the women's cheeks were burning. Not warm, the way skin gets warm in a crowded room full of dancing and body heat. Burning, feverish, uncomfortably hot against her own skin. She added something else, something harder to explain. The cheeks felt too firm, too dense, as though there was something beneath the skin that didn't belong there. Noura noticed it too when the next woman leaned in to greet her. She felt it clearly enough to register it as strange. But they had a paid job to do in a room full of what still looked, in every other respect, like an entirely normal wedding. She told her bandmate to ignore it and to keep working. They set up their instruments. The performance began. About half an hour into the set, one of Noura's bandmates went pale watching the dance floor. The women were dancing in the traditional style, arms raised, hair loosened and shaken free, a familiar rhythmic display you'd see at any Gulf wedding's women's section. Nothing about the movement itself was unusual. What was unusual was what filled their raised hands. Each dancer was gripping fistfuls of human hair, long, dark, recently cut by the look of it. Not old, not decorative, not a prop or an accessory. Some of it, according to the account, was still wet at the ends. Noura's bandmate tried to get her attention without breaking the rhythm of the performance, without drawing the guests' notice to the fact that something had been seen. Noura kept playing. She'd already decided, somewhere in the back of her mind, that stopping now, in a room full of people outnumbering her band by what felt like 30-1, was not a safe option, whatever was actually happening around them. The detail that almost everyone who has ever told this story remembers most clearly comes next. The dancers wore long, flowing robes, the kind of traditional wedding attire that should have covered their legs and feet completely, the way it always does at any ordinary celebration. But as the women spun and stepped through the dance, the hems of their robes lifted briefly with each movement, then settled back down. In that brief gap before the fabric fell again, Noura's bandmate looked down. What she saw underneath those robes was not feet. Some versions of the story describe goat hooves, a detail with deep roots in older Gulf folklore about disguised supernatural beings. But the version most widely repeated, the one that has stuck with people for over 30 years, describes something stranger. Still, raw lamb's legs, stripped bare, pale and skinned, stabbed through with knives and forks as though laid out on a butcher's serving table, and the women danced on them as easily and naturally as if they were their own ordinary feet. Noura's bandmate began to shake, barely able to hold her instrument steady. Noura, without breaking the drumbeat she was keeping, leaned toward her and told her, quietly, urgently, to keep playing. Not yet. They couldn't run yet. Not with a room full of guests who so vastly outnumbered them, guests who, it was now unmistakably clear, were not guests at all in any sense either woman had ever understood before that night. The bride and groom entered last, exactly as tradition dictates at any Gulf wedding. But they were not led to the customary kosha, the raised, flower-decorated bridal stage that sits at the center of every wedding hall Noura had ever performed in. Instead, they were guided toward a structure built at the far end of the room, shaped unmistakably like an enormous animal's head, jaws open wide. 2 chairs sat positioned inside that open mouth. The bride and groom were seated between the teeth. And then, without warning, every light in the mansion went out at once. In that instant of total darkness, the bandmate who had first seen the hooves didn't hesitate. She ran. Noura followed her without a second thought, and the rest of the band followed Noura. They left their instruments exactly where they sat. They left their bags, their shoes, everything they'd carried in with them just an hour earlier. They ran straight through the front door of that mansion, out into the street, and they did not stop running until they physically could not run any further. It was a man driving home in the early hours of the morning who finally stopped them. Somewhere around 3 a.m., a group of women in full wedding performance dress, barefoot, sprinting down a quiet residential street in an upscale part of Kuwait City. He pulled his car over and asked, reasonably enough, what on earth was happening. Noura told him everything all at once, barely able to get the words out in order. The phone call, the mansion, the burning cheeks, the fistfuls of hair, the lamb's legs stabbed through with silverware, the open-mouth structure where the bride and groom had been seated, the lights going out. He didn't laugh at her. He didn't dismiss it as panic or exhaustion. Instead, he turned his car around and drove them back toward the address Noura pointed him to. The building was there. It was real, standing exactly where she said it would be. Everything else about it was gone. No decorations, no lights, no music, no guests, no open front door welcoming them inside. The windows were dark and had clearly been dark for a very long time. The driveway was overgrown, choked with weeds that don't grow in a single night. The man told her plainly that the mansion had been abandoned for years. As far as he knew, no one had lived there in longer than he could remember. He drove them home after that. Noura Al-Taqaqa never performed at another wedding for the rest of her life. This is the part of the story where the different versions start to disagree with each other, and where I think it's worth being honest with you about that disagreement rather than picking the most dramatic version and presenting it as settled fact. The most widely shared version, the one you'll find repeated across paranormal forums and retellings online, claims that Noura died within weeks, or at most a few months, of that night. Some say she died quietly in her sleep. Others say her health simply collapsed afterward for no reason doctors could identify. A few versions go further, claiming she gave one private account of what happened before she died, and that the telling itself seemed to hasten the end. This is, by a wide margin, the ending most people want, because it gives the story a clean, cinematic shape. It also happens to be the version with the least evidence behind it. No date, no location, no documentation of any kind. A second, smaller branch of the story claims she survived the encounter but was never the same afterward, that she lived for years in seclusion, refused to discuss that night with anyone, and eventually was placed into private care as her mental state deteriorated. There's no record supporting this version either. The third version, the least dramatic, and arguably the most plausible if any part of the underlying story is true at all, simply says that she retired, quietly, privately. She stepped away from the wedding circuit that had defined her entire career, and she lived the rest of her life outside the public eye, away from performances, away from questions, away from anyone who might ask her to explain what had happened that night. What can actually be verified after 30 years of this story circulating? Almost nothing. There's no Kuwaiti death record matching the timeline, no documented interview in mainstream Gulf media, no authenticated photograph from the period. This is, in many ways, exactly how oral folklore tends to behave in that part of the world, a story that attaches itself to a real or possibly real person, reshaped a little more with every retelling, until the original woman and the legend built around her become almost impossible to separate. I think the honest answer is, we don't know, and we may never know. There's a case to be made for taking it seriously. The story lines up, detail for detail, with much older traditions in Gulf and Islamic folklore about jinns, beings that Islamic tradition describes as created from smokeless fire, living alongside humans in a largely unseen parallel existence, capable of taking on human shape but rarely able to fully disguise every part of themselves. Hooves under a dress, skin that runs unnaturally hot. A wrongness at the extremities that the human eye catches before the mind can name it. These aren't details invented for this story specifically. They show up in theological and folkloric writing about jinns that predates Noura's alleged wedding by centuries. The detail about hands full of human hair echoes older Kuwaiti tales about jinn brides said to collect hair as a kind of currency. There's an equally reasonable case for skepticism. There's no contemporary news account of a Kuwaiti musician fleeing a wedding under strange circumstances. No police report. No surviving bandmate who has ever come forward publicly under their own name. The mansion itself has never been identified or photographed by anyone claiming to have found it, and the details shift meaningfully depending on who's telling the story. The driver who found them changes identity from version to version. The ending changes entirely depending on who you ask. None of that proves it didn't happen. It simply means that if it did, every piece of evidence that might confirm it has either been lost to time, deliberately kept quiet, or never existed to begin with. What's kept this story alive for over 30 years, I think, isn't really the hooves or the lamb's legs or even the open-mouthed altar. It's the detail almost everyone remembers most vividly when they retell it. The fact that once Noura understood exactly what she was surrounded by, she didn't stop playing. She kept the beat going, calm and steady, because she understood that stopping might be the one thing that got her and her entire band killed. Noura's story is the most well-known version of this particular kind of tale, but it isn't the only one. Variations on a human performer accidentally plays a wedding for something that isn't human show up across the region, told about different musicians in different decades in different cities. There's an account, undated, of a traveling musician in eastern Yemen who accepted a wedding booking in what he believed was a remote village. When he arrived, there was no village at all, only a single elaborately decorated tent standing alone in empty terrain. He played for about an hour, was paid in old gold coins, and left without incident. The next day, when he tried to spend those coins, he found they had turned to dry leaves in his hands. There's a version centered on a young singer in mid-20th century Cairo who performed at a house that, like Noura's mansion, turned out to be abandoned when anyone went looking for it the following morning. In that telling, she didn't flee. She was paid in real ordinary currency and slept soundly that same night. But for the rest of her career, she refused every wedding booking that came her way afterward, and she never once explained why. A more recent variant, circulating online for roughly the last decade, places a male drummer at a women's wedding section in Bahrain. The bones of the story are nearly identical. A lavish house, guests who feel subtly wrong from the first greeting, and the slow dawning realization that the venue simply does not exist once daylight comes. None of these stories have any more solid evidence behind them than Noura's does. But the fact that this exact shape of story, human performer, generous last-minute booking, wrongness revealed slowly, and impossible building, keeps resurfacing across different decades and different countries, says something on its own about why it endures. If you grew up in the Gulf, there's a decent chance you first heard some version of this story from an older relative, maybe told half as entertainment, half as an actual warning, possibly at a wedding of your own family's. For 30 years, parents in Kuwait have used Noura's story to caution musicians against accepting bookings without properly verifying the address and the family behind them first. For 30 years, some taxi drivers in Kuwait City have quietly avoided certain residential streets after midnight, just in case. Whether Noura Al-Taqaqa was ever a real person, whether any of this happened the way it's been told, or whether it's simply become a legend that borrowed a real woman's name to carry an old warning forward, the story has kept doing exactly what it was built to do for 3 decades running. That's the story of Noura Al-Taqaqa, the singer at the JINN wedding, as it's most widely told. What do you think about it? If this one stayed with you, let me know in the comments and tell me which detail got you the most, the burning cheeks, the hair in their hands, or what was under those robes. If you want more stories like this, real folklore told the way it's actually been passed down, not cleaned up or exaggerated for shock value, Subscribe and turn on notifications because there are more legends like this one coming soon on this channel. And if you ever get offered a job that seems a little too easy for a little too much money at an address you don't recognize, maybe make the call back first.